All right, let's kick off this deep dive. You sent us a really intriguing collection of articles all about discourse analysis,
Oh, very cool.
and specifically, how identity is formed through language.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I find super fascinating, and I'm really excited to unpack all this with you. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, the articles you sent were Identity Formation and Discourse Analysis from September 19th,
Right.
Identity and Discourse Analysis from August 2nd, Political Identities and Discourse Analysis, that was October 26th,
Okay.
and Social Identity and Discourse Analysis from August 17th, all from 2024.
Gotcha.
So yeah, we're going to dive deep into how we communicate, how that actually shapes who we are.
I love it. Yeah, one of the biggest takeaways from these articles, and we see this kind of over and over again, is that identity isn't static. It's not like this fixed thing. It's constantly changing. It's evolving through our interactions.
Right.
And importantly, the language that we use.
Okay, that's interesting.
You can think of it almost like a performance, right? We're always kind of adapting our communication style to fit different roles, different contexts that we find ourselves in.
So it's not like we're born with a fixed identity. We're always like shaping and reshaping it, almost like Play-Doh, through language.
Exactly.
That makes me think about this idea of positioning theory, which a couple of these articles mentioned. Can you break that down for me? What does that mean?
Yeah, positioning theory is essentially how we use language to, well, claim or resist certain identities. Think about it like a job interview, right?
Yeah.
You're using very formal language. You're highlighting all your wonderful skills. You're answering questions in a way that presents you, that positions you
Yeah.
as a competent and desirable candidate.
So we're strategically using language to try to control or influence how people see us.
Exactly.
It's like a game in a way.
It is a game.
Yeah.
And it's a game that plays out in all of our social interactions.
What?
One of the articles used the example of employees, how they might adopt the company jargon or constantly talk about goals and, things like that to kind of align themselves with management.
Yeah.
It's a very subtle way, but they're using language to kind of fit into that workplace power structure.
It's like they're saying, hey, I'm one of you.
Yeah.
But using language is that tool
Yeah.
to, create that sense of belonging.
Exactly.
But, it also highlights how identity is relational, right?
Yeah.
Like we define ourselves in relation to others.
Absolutely. All of the articles, and really discourse analysis in general, emphasizes that our identity is negotiated in relation to those around us. It's not this fixed thing.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic process, and language is the tool that we use to navigate that complex social landscape.
This reminds me of the idea of code switching, which I think the Social Identity and Discourse Analysis article really got into. It's fascinating, how we shift our language styles depending on who we're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
I do it all the time without even realizing it.
Oh, absolutely. Code switching is such a great example of how we adapt our communication to fit in.
Right.
One of the examples they gave was a bilingual speaker who uses, maybe their native language at home.
True.
But then in a professional setting, they switch to the dominant language.
Right.
They're tapping into different parts of their identity.
It's like, yeah, you're using different aspects of yourself depending on the situation.
Totally.
And you realize how complex identity really is. And then, you add on top of that race, gender, class.
Oh, absolutely.
Talk about a lot to juggle.
Yeah, that's where this idea of intersectionality comes in, right? The articles emphasize that we don't experience these different facets of our identity in isolation.
Yeah.
They intersect and influence how we communicate.
Right.
One of the examples that they used was a young woman of color, right, navigating a very male-dominated industry.
Yeah, that makes sense.
She's not just a woman, she's not just a person of color, but those identities intersect and inform how she presents herself and how others perceive her.
It's like she's playing multiple roles at once.
Yeah.
And each one might require a different communication style.
Absolutely.
It's almost like we're constantly code switching in some way.
Yeah.
This reminds me of dominant discourses, which I know a couple of the articles talked about. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, dominant discourses are basically those societal norms that establish how certain identities, air quotes, should be expressed.
Right.
Often they're reflecting existing power structures and can end up marginalizing certain groups who don't quite fit the mold.
Yeah.
One of the examples they gave was how media often portrays women in a limited number of ways based on these very traditional gender norms.
It's like society hands you a script.
Yeah.
And if you deviate from it,
Right.
you might face some pushback.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it makes you wonder how much we actually control
Yeah.
how our identity is perceived. But then the articles also talk about resistance, right? People pushing back against these dominant narratives.
Yeah, political identities in discourse analysis had a lot to say about this.
Okay.
They highlight what are called counter discourses,
Right.
which challenge those dominant narratives and try to create space for alternative self-representation.
Interesting.
They specifically talk about queer discourse as a really powerful example
Yeah.
of how language can be used to redefine what's considered normal, create a more inclusive understanding of identity.
It's like you're rewriting the script entirely
Exactly.
and saying, hey, this old story's not working anymore. We need a new one that reflects the diversity of, human experience.
Absolutely. And they talk about how identity construction is always reflecting and perpetuating ideologies, right? Like, think about media portrayals of immigrants,
Right.
how they can reinforce certain stereotypes and shape public perception and, even lead to harmful policies.
It's almost like they're creating a narrative that's, influencing how we see entire groups of people.
Yeah. And the articles also touch on, not just those broader societal influences, but how political identities are shaped through language.
Okay.
They explore how political discourse
Right.
uses language to shape our understanding of ourselves politically.
Yeah.
Using labels like patriot or radical
Right.
to create in-groups and out-groups, influencing who we align with and how we view those who maybe hold different political views than our own.
So it's not just about conveying information.
Yeah.
It's about using language to shape our identity and create this sense of like us versus them.
Exactly.
And that makes me think about the discussion on national identity,
Yeah.
which is something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Well, and they talk about how national identity is constructed through narratives and rhetoric,
Yeah.
especially in political speeches.
Right.
They use the example of, Brexit. Oh, okay.
And how the discourse invoked ideas of, British independence and sovereignty
Okay.
to kind of create a political identity around leaving the European Union.
It's fascinating how these narratives tap into that shared sense of history and belonging.
Absolutely.
It makes you realize how powerful language can be in shaping our sense of who we are, not just individually, but collectively as well.
Yes, and we can't forget about the impact of social media, which is also discussed in the articles.
Oh, right.
And how these platforms allow us to perform different aspects of our identity online.
It's like we're creating different versions of ourselves
Totally.
for different platforms, right? I know I present myself very differently on, say, LinkedIn compared to Instagram.
Absolutely. It's like we're curating our identities online,
Yeah.
choosing which aspects we want to highlight or maybe downplay.
Right. Yeah.
And the articles also talk about how anonymity online can allow for exploring certain identities that might be stigmatized offline.
Oh, that's interesting. For example, they talk about LGBTQ plus individuals finding support and a sense of community in anonymous online spaces where they might feel safer.
It's fascinating how online platforms, provide spaces for both kind of curated self-presentation
Right.
and this genuine self-discovery.
Yeah.
It speaks to the all the facets of identity in the digital age.
Totally.
And I'm realizing how much we reveal about ourselves, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident,
Yeah.
through the language that we use, both online and offline.
Absolutely. And that's one of the key takeaways from all of these articles. They're really highlighting how language is a window
Right.
into our identities, revealing not just who we are, but how we see ourselves in relation to the world around us.
This has been a really insightful start to our deep dive.
Yeah.
I feel like we've covered so much.
Oh, we have.
From positioning theory to code switching to, the impact of media to the nuances of online identity.
Absolutely.
I need a minute to process all this.
For sure. We've thrown a lot of information at you.
Yeah.
But, this is just the beginning.
Okay.
So when we come back in part 2, we'll actually delve into some specific real-world examples
Oh, perfect.
to see how these kind of abstract ideas really play out in different contexts and, kind of shape our everyday experiences.
That sounds great. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
Oh.
Welcome back. I'm really excited to kind of dig into some specific examples
Yeah, me too.
that highlight how this all plays out,
Yeah.
in the real world.
It's one thing to talk about these concepts in theory,
Right.
but to actually see them in action, is what really makes it click.
Absolutely.
You mentioned political identities in discourse analysis earlier.
Yeah.
And one thing that really stood out to me was the discussion of how language is used to create a sense of national identity.
Yeah. Great point.
We see this all the time, especially in political rhetoric.
For sure.
Politicians use this very inclusive language.
Right.
We, the people,
Yeah.
to foster this sense of unity and shared purpose.
Absolutely.
Especially when they're advocating for certain policies or actions.
Totally. It's creating that in-group.
Right, solidifying their base.
Yeah. And they often contrast that in-group with an out-group.
Right.
That's often portrayed as a threat.
Yeah.
Think about how often you hear terms like outsiders
Oh, yeah.
or special interests thrown around.
Especially during campaigns.
Oh, absolutely. During election campaigns, it's all about creating that us versus them dynamic.
It's like they're drawing a line in the sand, right?
Exactly.
You're either with us or against us.
You're with us or you're against us.
And this kind of language can be really effective in mobilizing voters.
Absolutely.
But it can also be incredibly divisive,
Oh, for sure. And it can be dangerous when it's used to target, minority groups or to fuel nationalist sentiments.
Right. Yeah.
It's a good reminder that, language has this power to unite, but it also has this power to divide.
Absolutely. Makes you realize how important it is to be aware of the language that's being used around us.
Right.
And to challenge those who use it to, spread fear and division.
Exactly.
Speaking of challenging norms,
Okay.
the articles also talked about, gender dynamics in the workplace.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Identity formation and discourse analysis. Had some really interesting stuff on that.
I think one thing that really jumped out at me was how women in leadership positions, they often face this double bind when it comes to communication.
It's like if they're too assertive, they're seen as bossy.
Right.
But if they're too hesitant,
then they're not taken seriously.
their ideas might not be heard.
Exactly.
It's like walking a tightrope.
It is. They're trying to find that sweet spot, that balance.
Between being confident and being, perceived as likable.
Exactly.
And it's a lot of pressure.
It is.
And the articles mention that women often use, more inclusive language.
Yeah.
Like they use we instead of I.
Right.
To foster this sense of teamwork and collaboration.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And they might downplay their certainty when presenting ideas.
Uh-huh.
Using phrases like I think
Yeah.
or it seems like to soften their assertions.
Right.
It's almost like they're subconsciously adapting their communication style to fit into a workplace culture
Yeah.
that's still largely shaped by, these masculine norms.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting.
And it just highlights how those subtle language choices, they really can have a big impact on how women are perceived and how their ideas are received.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we all need to be more aware of these gendered expectations.
Right?
And how they can play out in our own interactions.
For sure.
Let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
I know based on the articles you picked, this is something you're really interested in. The role of language in shaping ethnic identity.
Yes, absolutely. Social identity and discourse analysis had some great points about that.
Yeah, the language that's used to describe different ethnic groups can have a huge impact on how they're perceived by the public.
Absolutely. And even seemingly small choices in wording can make a huge difference.
It's like the difference between describing a group of immigrants as hardworking versus labeling them as, illegal aliens.
Exactly.
One set of terms humanizes them, while the other dehumanizes them, reduces them to a problem that needs to be solved.
And unfortunately, we see that a lot, especially in media outlets, using language that reinforces those negative stereotypes and portrays certain ethnic groups as threats to society.
It's dangerous.
It is.
Because it can contribute to, prejudice and discrimination.
Absolutely.
Not to mention, harmful policies.
It really is a reminder that we need to be, critical consumers of media and challenge those who use language irresponsibly.
We've talked about national identity, gender dynamics, ethnic identity.
Yeah.
I'd be remiss if we didn't touch on professional identity.
Right.
Particularly in, academic discourse, which I know is something you're really interested in.
Absolutely. And identity and discourse analysis really went into detail about that.
Academics use very specialized terminology. They cite relevant sources. They engage in all these discourse practices like peer review to establish their credibility and contribute to their field.
It's like they're speaking this particular language that signals that they're part of this academic community.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just the words themselves, but how they're used.
Yeah.
Right? Academics tend to write in this very formal and objective style. They try to avoid personal opinions or emotional language.
Sure.
It's all about presenting research in a way that's seen as credible and objective.
But sometimes that formality can make academic writing really inaccessible to those outside the field,
Right.
which raises questions about, inclusivity and the need for clearer communication between experts and the public.
It's such a good point because knowledge is most powerful when it's, shared and understood by everyone,
Totally.
not just a select few.
Right.
And it brings us back to the core of what we've been exploring.
Exactly.
How language shapes our understanding of ourselves and the world around
It
us.
really is amazing, though.
Yeah.
We've talked about gender in the workplace, national identity in politics,
Right.
ethnic identity in the media, even professional identity in academia.
Right. All these different contexts.
And they all point back to the same fundamental idea
Yeah.
that language is constantly shaping our identities.
And it's not just about what we say, but,
The unspoken rules,
Yeah.
the subtle cues, the underlying assumptions.
right, exactly.
It's really about understanding those power dynamics,
Yeah.
that historical context,
Right.
the cultural norms that influence how we use language.
It's fascinating, and it's really making me think.
Well,
This has been a lot to take in.
I know we've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
but I'm eager to hear, your reflections as
Yeah.
we move into the final part of
Oh.
our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back to our deep dive on identity and discourse analysis. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has,
Yeah.
just exploring how language shapes who we are, how others see us. It's fascinating stuff.
We've covered so much. I mean, we started with those subtle ways we position ourselves in conversations. Then we talked about these broader narratives that shape our national and even global identities.
Right. And we've seen it play out in so many areas. The workplace, politics, media, even the online world. It's everywhere.
As we wrap things up, I'm really curious to hear what's resonated with you the most during this deep dive.
For me, it's how much we communicate without even thinking about it. Like, it's not just the words we say, it's so much more than that.
Oh, I know what you mean. It's like we're constantly sending signals about who we are, through our language choices, our tone, even our body language. It's all part of the equation.
Absolutely. And those signals, they have a real impact. They influence how we're treated and the opportunities that come our way. It's pretty powerful.
It makes you wonder, how much control do we really have over how our identity is perceived? I mean, is it all us, or is there something else at play?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The articles you chose, they highlight this tension between agency and those larger social structures. It's a balancing act.
Right. On the one hand, we get to choose how we present ourselves, but then on the other hand,
There are those societal expectations, the way language has been used to categorize people, even marginalize certain groups. It's a lot to navigate.
I keep coming back to the concept of dominant discourses,
Mhm.
those unspoken rules that shape what's normal. It's like if you don't fit neatly in those boxes, you're going against the grain. And that can be tough.
Absolutely. And it makes you realize how important it is to challenge those narratives, to make space for more diverse, more inclusive ways of being. There's got to be room for everyone.
Speaking of which, the articles you sent, especially political identities and discourse analysis, they have some really cool examples of how that's happening in different areas of life.
Oh, yeah. It was inspiring to see how activists and marginalized communities are using language to, reclaim their narratives. They're redefining what it means to belong.
It's like they're rewriting the script, flipping the power dynamics, and pushing for real change. It's so powerful.
It is. And that brings us back to that question we touched on earlier. If identity is so fluid, always being shaped by outside forces, is there a core self? Is there some essential you that stays the same no matter what?
It's a question I've been asking myself this whole time. Is there an answer?
Honestly, I don't think there's a simple one. It's probably not about finding a fixed point, but more like an ongoing journey of becoming...
Not the destination, right?
Exactly. It's about embracing all those complexities, those contradictions that make each of us unique. It's about recognizing that we're all constantly evolving, becoming more fully ourselves.
Well said. So, to our listener, the one who sparked this whole deep dive, thank you. Your curiosity has taken us on quite an adventure.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
We've only scratched the surface, but hopefully you've learned a thing or two about how language shapes us. It's powerful stuff.
Remember, language is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
It's our choice how we wield it. Let's choose to use it to build bridges, to challenge injustice, and to create a more inclusive world for everyone.
Absolutely. It's been a fantastic deep dive.
Until next time, keep those fascinating ideas coming. We'll be here to explore them with you.